She filed for divorce expecting my overseas contracts to be divided equally. I produced the separate asset ledger and international ownership structure. The judge ruled in my favor. Months later, she requested reconciliation after legal fees drained her savings. Your overseas contracts are marital property, and I want half. She said it like she was ordering coffee. Like 7 years of my life, my 4 a.m. calls with Singapore, my missed dinners, my blood pressure medication sitting on the bathroom counter. All of it was just a line item she could circle with a red pen. I remember the exact moment. She was standing at the kitchen island, fully dressed, holding a manila envelope like it was already decided. No build-up. No argument the night before. No sign that I was walking into the end of my marriage when I came downstairs that Tuesday morning. Just that envelope. And those words. Your overseas contracts are marital property. I want half. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just stood there in my socks on the cold tile floor, holding a mug of coffee that was still too hot to drink, staring at the woman I had built an entire life with. And the strangest thing happened. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even that shocked. I was just calm, because somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I had stopped visiting because it hurt too much to spend time there, I already knew this was coming. I had known for a long time. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I'm 44 years old. I've spent the last 12 years working in international energy consulting, the kind of work that sounds glamorous until you're on your 3rd flight in 4 days, and your hotel room in Dubai looks exactly like your hotel room in Rotterdam looks exactly like your hotel room in Houston. I met Vanessa when I was 32 and she was 29. We were at a charity event in Chicago that neither of us actually wanted to attend. She was funny, sharp, and completely unimpressed by me, which I found absolutely irresistible. We dated for 2 years, got married in a small ceremony in Colorado, and settled into a life that looked, from the outside, like it had everything. Nice house in the suburbs, 2 cars, dinner parties with the neighbors, vacations we photographed more than we actually experienced. The whole thing. What the photographs didn't show was how the years had quietly carved a distance between us that neither of us had ever seriously tried to close. She had her world, her marketing consultancy, her book club, her college friends who came to visit twice a year. I had mine, the contracts, the clients, the time zones, the structured assets spread across 3 different holding companies in jurisdictions that made her eyes glaze over every single time I tried to explain them. We were polite. We were functional. We were 2 people sharing a house and a last name and slowly, steadily, running out of things to say to each other. I think we both knew it. I think neither of us was willing to say it first. And then she did. Not in those words, but with that envelope. I set my coffee down on the counter. I looked at the envelope. I looked at her. You've already talked to a lawyer, I said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer right away. She set the envelope down on the island and crossed her arms, and I noticed, with the strange clarity you get in moments like that she was wearing the bracelet I'd given her for our 5th anniversary. I've done some research, she said. Right. The Singapore contracts alone, the active ones you renewed last year, those are worth nearly $2 million in projected revenue over the next 3 years. I had someone look at the numbers. You had someone look at my numbers. Our numbers, she said. We're married. I picked up the envelope. I didn't open it. I just held it. Is this where we are? I asked. She looked at me, and for just a second, just one, I thought I saw something flicker across her face. Something that wasn't a lawyer's calculation or wounded pride or whatever she'd been feeding herself for however long she'd been building to this moment. But it was gone as fast as it came. I think we've been here for a while, she said. I'm just the one who's naming it. I nodded slowly. I put the envelope under my arm. I picked my coffee back up, and I walked out of the kitchen. That night, I sat in my home office for 4 hours. Not working, just thinking. There's a version of this story where I panicked, where I called her crying, begged her to reconsider, showed up at whatever restaurant she was pretending to have dinner at while actually meeting her lawyer friend Christine, and made promises I wasn't sure I could keep. I'd seen other men do it. Watched good, decent people dissolve under the pressure of an unexpected divorce filing and hand over things they'd spent decades building because the emotional shock made them stupid. I was not going to do that. Not because I didn't love her. In whatever complicated, weathered way love survives 7 years of neglect and distance, I did still love her. But because I knew something she didn't. Or rather, I knew something she thought she knew, but didn't actually understand. And the difference between knowing and understanding in a courtroom is everything. Let me explain how my business is structured, because this matters. When I started out in international energy consulting, I was a sole proprietor operating on contracts through a US-based LLC I had formed before I met Vanessa. That LLC, let's call it the domestic entity, handled local work. But as I expanded into overseas markets, particularly Southeast Asia and the Middle East, I worked with a financial attorney to set up what's called an international holding structure. This wasn't tax evasion. This wasn't hiding money. This was standard, above-board asset protection designed for professionals operating across multiple international jurisdictions. The Singapore contracts, the ones Vanessa had apparently been having someone look at, were not held by my domestic LLC. They were held by a separately formed Singapore-registered private limited company that I had established 4 years before our marriage. With its own capitalization, its own operating history, its own bank accounts, audited financials, and legal identity that predated Vanessa by half a decade. The structure had been documented in my prenuptial agreement, which Vanessa had signed, along with her own attorney who had reviewed it and raised zero objections. I had also maintained, from the first day of our marriage, a meticulous separate asset ledger. Every overseas contract, every international revenue stream, every contribution from my premarital capital, timestamped, categorized, cross-referenced with the original holding company formation documents. My financial attorney, a man named Theodore who had been practicing international business law for 30 years and who had the bedside manner of a particularly patient accountant, had helped me maintain it. Not because I expected divorce, but because I expected audits. And because Theodore had drilled into me, from day one, that the moment you can't prove the provenance of an asset, you've already half lost it. I had every document, going back 12 years. I called Theodore the next morning. She filed, he said. Serve me papers. Wants equitable distribution. Her argument is going to be that the overseas contracts are marital income streams. Theodore was quiet for a moment. Has she actually looked at the structure documentation? I don't think she's looked at anything beyond the revenue projections that someone pulled for her. Interesting, he said. And the way he said it, slow, measured, like someone who had just been handed a puzzle they already knew how to solve, settled something in my chest. Are the ledgers current? He asked. Through last quarter. Singapore entity documentation? In the fireproof safe in the office. Everything from formation forward. And the prenup? She signed it with counsel. Her lawyer's name is on the acknowledgement certificate. He was quiet again. Let her file, Theodore said. Let her build her case. And then let's educate everyone in that courtroom about what marital property actually is. The next few weeks were the strangest kind of quiet. Vanessa and I were still living in the same house. Technically, she'd moved into the guest room with a politeness that felt more cutting than screaming would have. We were unfailingly civil. Good morning. Pass the coffee. I'll be home late. There's pasta in the fridge. Just two adults operating at a careful distance, like planets that had drifted just far enough apart to stop exerting any real gravitational pull on each other. Her attorney, a woman named Rebecca who had apparently built a reputation on high-asset divorces, sent Theodore a formal discovery request that was, by all accounts, aggressively optimistic in scope. They wanted everything. Every contract. Every account. Every entity structure. Every piece of documentation going back to the beginning of my career. Theodore called me after he reviewed it. They think they're going to find something you've been hiding, he said. There's nothing hidden. I know that, he said. That's what's going to be the problem for them. He paused. They've built their entire case on the assumption that these overseas assets are going to look like marital income. Revenue flowing into your household. Shared benefit. Standard equitable distribution argument. And instead they're going to discover that the Singapore entity and the Dubai consulting arrangement have been legally separate since before you said your vows, and that you've documented that separation with the kind of precision that most forensic accountants don't see outside of publicly traded companies. He almost sounded proud. Send them everything, I told him. He did. I remember the afternoon Rebecca's team must have actually started going through it, because that's when Vanessa came into my office. She didn't knock. She just stood in the doorway, and there was something different in her expression. The certainty that had been there since that Tuesday morning in the kitchen, that clean, lawyer-fed confidence that she knew exactly what she was entitled to, was not as solid as it had been. The Singapore company, she said. Yes. It was formed before we met. For years before. She looked at me for a long moment. You never told me about the holding structure. I turned my chair to face her fully. Vanessa, I said, as evenly as I could manage, we signed a prenuptial agreement. The holding structure and the premarital assets were listed in the disclosure schedule attached to it. Your attorney reviewed it. You signed it. I signed it because you said it was standard. It was standard. It was also accurate. She was quiet. The revenue from those contracts goes through that company, she said, more to herself than to me. It doesn't touch the joint accounts unless I pay myself a management distribution, which I've documented separately. She didn't say anything to that. How much of our lifestyle has come from those distributions? She asked. A portion, I said. I've been transparent about that in the discovery documents. Theodore has provided the full accounting. A portion, she repeated. Vanessa, you have a marketing consultancy. You have income. This isn't. My consultancy made $140,000 last year, she said, her voice tight. Your overseas contracts made more than that in a quarter, which is why the structure matters, and why it was disclosed before our marriage. She stood there for another few seconds. Then she left, and I sat in my office listening to the house settle around me and felt something I wasn't expecting. Not satisfaction, not anger, just an enormous, bone-deep sadness. The mediation failed in about 40 minutes. Rebecca had come in with a number, a specific dollar figure representing what she believed Vanessa was entitled to as her share of what she characterized as marital business income. Theodore had come in with a binder, not a metaphorical binder, an actual binder, 3 inches thick, tabbed and cross-referenced, containing every formation document, every audited financial, every time-stamped ledger entry, the prenuptial agreement with the disclosure schedule, and 6 supporting legal precedents from family courts in 3 different states addressing the treatment of premarital international business entities. Rebecca looked at the binder. She looked at Theodore. Counselor, Theodore said, in the mild voice of a man who is very, very comfortable. I think we may have a foundational disagreement about what constitutes a marital asset in this matter. The mediator, a retired judge named Harrington who had done this for 15 years, took one look at the binder and asked for a 15-minute recess. He came back. He looked at Rebecca. Has your client reviewed the prenuptial disclosure schedule? He asked. We have reviewed all relevant. The disclosure schedule, Harrington repeated. Specifically, the attached schedule listing separately held premarital business entities. There was a pause. We are prepared to argue that the revenue streams from those entities constitute. I'm asking a simpler question, Harrington said. Has your client reviewed the prenuptial disclosure schedule? Another pause. Longer. We will need to reassess certain aspects of our position, Rebecca said. Harrington looked at Theodore. Theodore looked at me. I looked at my hands. The reassessment did not lead to a reasonable settlement offer. I want to be fair about this. Rebecca was a competent attorney working with what her client had told her, and I believe, genuinely, that Vanessa had not fully absorbed what she had signed 7 years earlier. She had been told it was standard. She had not been told what standard actually meant. But the consequence of that gap was that she had spent months and a very significant amount of money building a case around assets she did not have a legal claim to. When the revised offer came, it was a fraction of the original demand, and it was still asking for things that Theodore thought were arguable at best. We went to court. I'm not going to tell you that standing in a courtroom while your marriage gets dissected in front of a judge feels like anything other than what it is. It is humiliating, even when you're right. It is exhausting. It makes you feel like a balance sheet instead of a person. Vanessa sat across from me in a charcoal blazer, her dark hair pulled back, and she didn't look at me once during the proceedings that I noticed. I try not to look at her either. Theodore presented the case methodically. Formation documents for the Singapore entity, the Dubai consulting arrangements operating history, the separate asset ledger, which the judge reviewed for a long time, the prenuptial disclosure schedule. Rebecca argued, and she argued well, actually, that certain distributions from the overseas entities into the joint household accounts had commingled the assets, blurring the separation. Theodore had anticipated this. He had the documentation showing exactly which funds from which sources had entered which accounts and when, with a forensic accountant's analysis attached. The judge, a woman named Whitmore who had been on the family court bench for 11 years, asked several pointed questions. She wanted to know if the prenuptial agreement had been entered into with independent counsel. Theodore cited the acknowledgement certificate. She wanted to know if the separate asset ledger had been continuously maintained or constructed after the fact. Theodore walked her through the timestamps and the quarterly update history, which my accountant was able to testify to. She wanted to know if the distributions from overseas entities had been structured in a way designed to obscure their origin. Theodore handed her a summary document that showed every distribution, clearly labeled, clearly sourced. Whitmore looked at the documentation for a long time. Then she looked at Rebecca. "Counselor, I've reviewed the disclosure schedule attached to the prenuptial agreement. The business entities in question were clearly identified as premarital separate property. I've reviewed the ledger. The separation appears to have been rigorously maintained. What is the basis of your claim that the overseas contracts constitute marital property subject to equitable distribution?" Rebecca argued commingling. Whitmore considered it. She ruled against it. The ruling came 3 weeks later. I was sitting in Theodore's office when he called to tell me. The overseas entities, the Singapore Private Limited Company, the Dubai Consulting Structure, were determined to be premarital separate property based on the formation dates, the prenuptial disclosure schedule, and the continuous maintenance of the separate asset ledger. The commingling argument was rejected. The distributed funds that had entered the marital estate were treated as income for purposes of calculating the marital standard of living, not as conversion of the underlying assets. The domestic LLC and the jointly owned property, the house, 2 vehicles, a joint investment account, were divided equitably. Vanessa received half of the joint assets. She did not receive a share of the overseas contracts. She did not receive a share of the Singapore entity. She did not receive what her lawyer had originally told her she was entitled to. Theodore was professional about it. He presented the ruling in plain language, walked me through the timeline for finalizing the asset division, and shook my hand. I drove home. Or, not home exactly. To the house that was still technically both of ours until the paperwork was finalized. And I sat in the driveway for a few minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, watching the lights in the kitchen window, and I thought, this is it. This is actually what the end looks like. The final paperwork took another 2 months. During that time, we were like 2 trains that had been running on the same track for years, now slowly rerouting to different destinations. Vanessa began the process of finding her own place. I stopped coming home at any predictable time. We communicated almost entirely through our attorneys. The few times we were in the same space, signing documents, dealing with the house logistics, we were exquisitely, painfully polite. She had lost weight. I noticed that. I also noticed that the book club had apparently stopped meeting at our house, and that the friends who used to come over for dinner hadn't been around in months. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place anymore. When the divorce was finalized on a quiet Thursday afternoon in late winter, I was sitting in Theodore's conference room, and Vanessa was sitting in Rebecca's office across town. We didn't see each other for the signing. It was done by courier. Theodore brought me a cup of coffee, which I thought was a thoughtful touch. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said. He nodded, in the way of a man who has heard that particular lie in his conference room more times than he can count. "What now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "you get on with it." I moved back into the house. It felt enormous. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a finished basement I had never once actually used. I had a cleaning service come through, which helped. I bought new sheets. I rearranged the furniture in the living room slightly, just enough that it stopped looking like a photograph of something that no longer existed. Work, as work tends to do, picked up. The Singapore contracts expanded. I brought on 2 new clients in the UAE, and Theodore helped me structure the arrangements properly. I flew a lot. I called my brother from airport lounges and told him I was fine. He didn't believe me, but he also knew me well enough not to push. I started running again, which I hadn't done seriously since my early 30s. I went to sleep at a reasonable hour. I woke up early. I made my own coffee. I was genuinely okay. Not happy, not in any spectacular way, but okay. There's something almost uncomfortable about how manageable life is when you remove a source of chronic low-grade tension from it. The silence in the house at 6 a.m. was not sad silence. It was just quiet, and I found that I didn't mind it. For months after the divorce was finalized, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "It's Vanessa. Can we talk?" I stared at my phone for a long time. I had changed phones during the process, not intentionally to cut contact, but as part of a routine upgrade, and apparently she hadn't been sure I still had her number, which is why she'd led with the identification. I typed, "Sure." "About what?" She responded, "Not over text. Can we meet for coffee?" I thought about it. I thought about it for probably longer than necessary. And then I typed, "When?" We met at a coffee shop near the neighborhood where she'd rented a small apartment. I had driven past the building once, not intentionally, just geographically, and it was a far cry from the house we'd shared. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked different. Not just the weight, though that was still visible, and it concerned me a little, that protective instinct you can't entirely switch off for someone you spent 7 years with. She looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. I sat down. "Thanks for coming," she said. "Of course." A waitress came over and I ordered coffee. We were quiet for a moment. "How are you?" Vanessa asked. "Good," I said. "You?" She tilted her head slightly. "Honestly, if you want." She looked down at her mug. The legal fees were more than I expected. I didn't say anything. "Rebecca is very good at her job," she said. "But very good at her job in a high-asset divorce is expensive, I imagine." Between her fees and the forensic accountant she brought in and Vanessa paused. It was a lot. She looked up. I had to dip into my personal savings significantly. The amount I received from the joint asset division, plus what I've made from the consultancy. "I'm okay. I want to be clear. I'm financially okay." "Good. But not what I expected to be," she said. I held my coffee and waited. This was her conversation to lead. I had not come here to fill her silences. "I've had a lot of time to think," she said. "About a lot of things." "Okay. About the prenup. About the disclosure schedule." She gave a small, rueful sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "About the fact that my lawyer apparently did not read the disclosure schedule as carefully as she might have. I'm sorry you were put in that position." She looked at me sharply. "You are. Not by me," I said. "I don't apologize for the documentation. But yes, I'm sorry that you were given an expectation and it didn't match reality. That's not a comfortable position." She was quiet. "She told me it was a strong case," Vanessa said. "She told me the overseas revenue streams would almost certainly be considered marital assets because of how they'd benefited our standard of living." "She wasn't insane for making that argument," I said. "In some circumstances, it would have been the right argument. In ours, the documentation made it untenable." Vanessa looked at me. "How long had you been maintaining that ledger?" "Since the first month of our marriage," I said. Theodore insisted. I followed his advice. She absorbed that. "So even in the early years, when things were good." "Yes. You were documenting the separation of your overseas assets." "Not as a hedge against divorce," I said. "As a professional practice. For audits. For the integrity of the international structures. It had nothing to do with us, specifically." She nodded slowly. "I didn't know that." "I know." There was a long pause. Outside the coffee shop window, a couple walked past with a dog. A normal Tuesday afternoon. "I want to ask you something," Vanessa said. "Go ahead." She looked at me directly. "Do you think there's any possibility?" She stopped. Started again. "We were together for 9 years. 7 married. And I've been sitting in a small apartment for 4 months going through legal bills and thinking about all the ways Another pause. "I didn't fight for us," she said. "That's what I keep coming back to. I was so angry, and I was so convinced that I was being taken advantage of somehow, that I filed instead of talking. And now I'm trying to figure out if that was a mistake I can ask you to help me undo." I set down my coffee. I looked at her for a long moment. And I want to be honest about what happened in that moment. Because there's a version of this story that ends differently. There's a version where I looked at her tired face and her smaller apartment and the bracelet she was still wearing, and I felt the pull of everything familiar and said yes. Came back. Tried again. Became one of those couples who says we went through hell, but we made it at dinner parties. I felt that pull. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. But I also felt something else, something quieter and more honest. I felt the 6 a.m. silence in my house. The clean desk. The new sheets. The runs I'd been going on every morning that had given me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost. I felt the absence of a particular kind of anxiety that I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped recognizing it as anxiety and had just accepted it as the texture of being alive. "Vanessa," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something first, and I need you to be honest with me. Okay, is this, what you're asking, is it about us? About missing what we had, the actual person, the actual relationship? Or is it about the financial reality you're in right now and what being married to me looked like from a stability standpoint?" She flinched. A small movement, quickly controlled. "That's not a fair question," she said. "I think it's the most important question," I said. "And I think if you're being honest with yourself, you know that the timing of this conversation, 4 months after the divorce, after the legal fees hit, after the division of assets was not what you expected is not a coincidence. Her jaw tightened. I'm not asking to get back together because of money. I'm not saying you are, I said. Not entirely. I'm saying that the financial reality has removed a comfort that you expected to have, and in its absence you're looking at what else was lost, and that's causing a recalibration. That's human. I'm not judging you for it. But, she said. But, I said, I don't think a recalibration brought on by circumstance is the same thing as the work we would have needed to do to actually fix what was broken. And what was broken wasn't the prenup. It wasn't the documentation. It wasn't anything legal. She was very still. We had stopped being a team, I said, years before you walked into the kitchen with that envelope. And neither of us did anything about it. We just kept being polite and separate and vaguely lonely and calling that a marriage. Her eyes were bright now. I know, she said quietly. I know you know, I said. So the question isn't whether we could technically be in the same house again. The question is whether either of us is actually prepared to do the hard thing, which is figure out how we got so far apart in the first place, and do the work to be different people who are genuinely good for each other. She looked at me. Are you saying you don't think we can? I took a breath. I'm saying I don't know. And I'm saying that I'm not willing to walk back into something because it's familiar, or because the alternative feels harder than expected. That's not fair to either of us. A silence, longer than the others. She looked out the window. I thought you'd be angrier, she said. After everything. I said. For a while. Not at you, specifically. At the situation. At how it could have gone differently if we'd both just talked to each other like humans instead of building cases. She laughed a little. It was a sad sound. I had a very good case, I thought. I know you did. And then I had a very expensive lesson. Yeah. She looked back at me. I'm sorry, she said. For how I handled it. For the assumptions I made. For the envelope instead of a conversation. I nodded. I'm sorry too, I said. For the years of being checked out. For treating our marriage like a background feature of my life instead of the thing itself. We sat with that for a while. Two people in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, sorting through the wreckage of something that had once been real. What do we do? She asked. Honestly, I said. We move forward. Separately, probably. Not because I hate you, I don't. But because I think we both need to figure out who we are on our own before we can figure out if there's anything worth going back to. She absorbed that. And if I figure that out, she said. If some months from now I've done the work and you've done the work, then maybe we have coffee again, I said. And we're honest. Like this. She nodded. She looked down. And then, quietly. Thank you for not being cruel about it. There's nothing to be cruel about, I said. We were just two people who lost track of each other. I paid for the coffee. She walked with me to the door of the coffee shop, and we stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the cold air moving between us. The bracelet, I said. She looked down at her wrist. I know, she said. I keep meaning to take it off. You don't have to, I said. It looked good on you then. It still does. She smiled at me. A real smile, small and unguarded, for the first time in what felt like years. Take care of yourself, I said. You too, she said. And I walked back to my car. I want to be careful about how I frame what happened next, because I'm aware of how these stories can tip into self-congratulation, and that's not what this is. I didn't walk away from that coffee shop feeling like I'd won. The court had already given me that, the legal victory, the ruling, the validation of 12 years of careful documentation. I didn't need a second trophy. What I felt, walking back to my car with the cold air on my face, was something more like clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives after a very long period of confusion and settles into you quietly, without fanfare. I had spent years in a marriage that had been slowly becoming something neither of us actually wanted. I had watched it happen and told myself it was fine. She had watched it happen and built a case instead of a conversation. Both of those things were failures, mine and hers, in different shapes. And the legal battle, the prenup, the ledger, the holding structure, the ruling, all of that had just been the shape that our particular failure took. Another marriage, different people, different documentation, might have told the same story in completely different legal language and ended in the same place. We had run out of road. And the question of who owned what when we got to the end of it was, in the grand scale of things, the least interesting part. 6 months later, Vanessa sent me a text. Not about reconciliation. Not about legal matters. Just, thought of you. I started running. You were right, it helps. I smiled at my phone for a moment. I typed back, good. Morning runs, or evening? She said, morning. I hate it, and it's the best thing in my day. I sent a thumbs up. And that was it. Two people who had shared a life, navigating what it looks like to be strangers who aren't exactly strangers. Building something new. Separate. Honest. No ledgers required. There's something I want to say to anyone who's been in a situation like this. Not the legal specifics, but the pattern. Because the pattern is not unique. I've talked to enough people, heard enough stories in airport lounges and office hallways and the particular intimacy of 4 a.m. phone calls with people in different time zones, to know that this shape, the slow drift, the unspoken distance, the moment someone reaches for a lawyer before they reach for their partner, is not as rare as we'd like to think. And the ledger, the documentation, the prenup, all of it. People sometimes look at that and say, so you were always prepared for this. As if preparation and love are opposites. They're not. I had documentation because Theodore told me to have documentation. I had a prenuptial agreement because responsible people who own complicated international assets have prenuptial agreements. None of that was a statement about how I felt about Vanessa. It was a statement about how I felt about fiduciary responsibility and professional diligence. The two things existed in completely different rooms of my life. And the lesson, the actual lesson, not the legal one, is that I should have paid as much attention to the first room as I paid to the second. I was meticulous about my asset ledger. I was careless about my marriage. And in the end, both of those things were true at the same time. Theodore called me about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. He had a new client who was going through a similar situation, overseas assets, international structure, a spouse who believed they were entitled to a portion of premarital business holdings. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak with the client, informally, about the experience of going through the process, not as legal advice, just as someone who had been on the other side of it. I thought about it. Tell him, I said, that the documentation matters enormously. But the documentation is not the story. The documentation is just the evidence. Theodore paused. What's the story? The story, I said, is everything that happened before anyone walked into a courtroom. And if he hasn't looked hard at that part yet, he should. Because the judge can sort out the asset ledger. But nobody else is going to sort out the rest of it for him. Theodore was quiet for a moment. I'll pass that along, he said. Good. How are you, he asked. Better, I said. He nodded. I could hear it somehow, the particular silence of a man who finds that answer believable. Good, he said. The house sold in the spring. Jointly owned, jointly listed, proceeds split per the settlement. I was in Singapore for a contract meeting when it closed. I got the notification on my phone, a wire transfer confirmation, a short email from the real estate attorney, done. I was sitting in a glass conference room 19 floors up, looking out at the harbor, and I thought about the first night Vanessa and I had spent in that house. We'd had no furniture yet, just sleeping bags and a bottle of wine and a lot of plans. It had been a good night. It had been, genuinely, a good night. I held that for a moment. Not with grief exactly. More the way you hold a photograph of somewhere you've been and know you won't go back to. The acknowledgement that it was real, and it mattered, and now it was something else. Then the meeting started, and I turned my attention to the contracts on the table in front of me. The work that had been there before her. The work that was still here after. Documented, structured, properly held. Mine. I moved into an apartment downtown. Smaller than the house, obviously. Easier. A spare room I turned into a proper home office with decent lighting and a desk I actually liked. A balcony where I had coffee every morning before my run. A kitchen that was mine to keep exactly as organized or disorganized as I chose. My brother came to visit in November, and we spent a weekend doing nothing in particular. Watching football, ordering food, having the kind of long, formless conversations you can only have with someone who has known you your entire life. On his last night, we were sitting on the balcony with drinks, and he asked me, "Are you happy?" I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, instead of reaching for the automatic fine. Not unhappy, I said, which I know sounds like a low bar, but compared to where I was, yeah, not unhappy is actually pretty good. He considered that. Would you do it differently? He asked. If you went back. I looked at the city lights for a while. I'd have paid more attention, I said. To her. To us. To the parts that were slipping before I noticed they were slipping. But the documentation. The documentation was never the problem, I said. The problem was sitting in the same house for years, two functional, capable adults, and never quite having the conversation about whether we were actually happy, whether we were actually getting what we needed, whether we were actually there for each other or just coexisting. My brother was quiet. That sounds like a lot of couples, he said. It probably is, I said. What do you do about that? You talk, I said. You talk when it's uncomfortable. You talk when you'd rather not. You talk even when things are fine, because fine is where the distance starts. It starts in the fine. He nodded slowly. Is that wisdom you got from the divorce? I laughed. It's wisdom I got too late, I said. But yeah, I have it now, for whatever it's worth. Last month, I was going through some old files, physical documents, the kind that accumulate at the back of filing cabinet drawers, and I found a photograph. Early in the marriage. Somewhere in the south of France, a trip we'd taken for our second anniversary. Vanessa was laughing at something, one hand raised against the bright sun, looking back over her shoulder at whoever was behind the camera. At me, specifically. I held the photo for a while, and then I filed it back in the drawer. Not to forget it, just to put it where it belonged. In the past. In the properly documented, carefully maintained, honestly labeled past. Where it would be there if I ever needed to find it. But where it didn't need to be out on the desk anymore. I still talk to Theodore quarterly. The Singapore contracts are performing well. The Dubai arrangement renewed for 2 more years. I'm structured. I'm documented. I'm running 5 days a week now instead of 3. And I'm building something, slowly, honestly, without rushing it. That feels more like the life I actually want than the life I accidentally ended up in. That's enough. For now, that is genuinely enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've been the person who thought they knew what they were entitled to, or the person who watched something end and didn't understand how it got there, I hope what you take from it isn't the legal strategy. I hope what you take is the simpler thing. Talk to your person. Before the envelope. Before the discovery request. Before the coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon when it's already too late to be anything except honest. Talk to them now, while there's still something to save.